The valley was silent, save for the distant clatter of armor and the occasional sound of heavy footsteps. On one side stood the Philistine army, their confidence bolstered by the presence of their champion, Goliath. Towering over 9 feet tall, Goliath was a warrior like no other, armed with a massive spear and clad in bronze from head to toe. His voice thundered across the valley as he issued his challenge. "Choose a man to come down and fight me. If he can kill me, we will become your servants. But if I kill him, you will serve us." For 40 days, Goliath repeated his taunts, and each time the men of Israel shrank back in fear. Among them was King Saul, who once stood tall in his own courage, but now seemed paralyzed. The Israelites faced not just a physical giant, but a spiritual one, a challenge to their faith and identity as God's chosen people. Then came David. He wasn't a soldier, nor had he come to fight. The youngest son of Jesse, David had been sent to bring food to his older brothers who were stationed at the battlefield. A shepherd boy, he was more accustomed to the quiet hillsides than the chaos of war. Yet, as he arrived and heard Goliath's defiance, something stirred within him. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's question wasn't just about Goliath. It was about the faith of his own people. Where others saw fear, David saw an opportunity for God's glory to be revealed. Word of David's boldness spread quickly, reaching King Saul. When David was brought before the king, Saul's first reaction was doubt. "You are only a boy," he said. "How can you fight him?" But David replied with unwavering confidence, recounting how God had delivered him from the lion and the bear while he was tending his sheep. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, perhaps reluctantly, allowed David to face the giant, offering his own armor as protection. But the armor didn't fit. It was heavy, cumbersome, and unfamiliar. David removed it, choosing instead the tools he knew: his sling, 5 smooth stones from the stream, and most importantly, his faith in God. Picture this moment: a shepherd boy standing alone in a valley, facing a fully armed giant. To the Philistines, it must have seemed laughable. To the Israelites, it likely appeared hopeless. Yet David stepped forward, not in his own strength, but in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel. As Goliath saw David approach, he sneered. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" But David's reply was powerful and unwavering. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." David's words weren't just a declaration, they were a testimony to his faith. He understood that the battle was not his, but God's, and with that, he reached into his bag, took out a stone, and slung it with precision. This is where we pause for a moment of reflection. How often do we feel overwhelmed by the giants in our lives? It could be fear, doubt, or a seemingly impossible situation. Like David, we're often called to face these challenges not with the world's tools, but with the strength and faith that God provides. As the stone left David's sling, a shift began, not just in the physical battle, but in the spiritual realm. The stone flew through the air, guided not by mere human skill, but by divine purpose. It struck Goliath squarely on the forehead, embedding itself deeply. The giant staggered for a brief moment, his towering frame faltering before he collapsed to the ground with a deafening thud. The armies of both sides stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. David didn't hesitate. He ran toward Goliath, standing over the fallen warrior. Finding no sword of his own, David drew Goliath's massive blade and used it to fulfill his promise, cutting off the giant's head. In that moment, the Philistines' confidence shattered, and they fled in terror. The Israelite army, emboldened by David's victory, surged forward, pursuing their enemies and claiming a decisive triumph. This moment wasn't just a physical victory, it was a spiritual one. David's faith and obedience turned the tide of an entire battle, proving that no obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seems, is greater than the power of God. But there's more to this story than just the defeat of Goliath. Consider this. Why did David choose 5 stones when one was enough? Scholars suggest several interpretations, but one compelling idea is that the extra stones weren't for Goliath alone. The Bible mentions that Goliath had 4 brothers, also giants. David wasn't preparing for failure. He was preparing for future battles, fully confident that God would deliver him again if needed. This detail challenges us to think about our own preparation in life. Are we relying on God not just for the battle at hand, but for the ones to come? David's example shows us the importance of trusting in God's provision for every season, equipping ourselves spiritually for whatever lies ahead. Another profound element of this story is the rejection David faced before stepping into his calling. His own brother, Eliab, accused him of arrogance, questioning his motives for coming to the battlefield. King Saul doubted his ability, dismissing him as a mere boy. Yet David didn't allow their words to shake his faith. Instead, he remained steadfast, grounded in his belief that God had prepared him for this moment. How often do we face similar challenges? Maybe there are voices around us, or even within us, saying we're not qualified, not strong enough, or not ready for what lies ahead. David's story reminds us that God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. When we step out in faith, trusting in His plan, He provides everything we need to succeed. Reflect on the humility David displayed throughout this event. Even after achieving such a monumental victory, he didn't take the credit for himself. From the beginning, he made it clear that the battle belonged to the Lord. This humility is a hallmark of David's character and one of the reasons he is described as a man after God's own heart. As we think about the significance of this story, let's ask ourselves some key questions. What giants are we facing in our lives? Are we trusting in God's power to overcome them, or are we relying on our own strength? And perhaps most importantly, are we stepping into the battles God has called us to, even when the odds seem impossible? David's victory over Goliath wasn't just about defeating a giant. It was about demonstrating the glory and power of God. It was a reminder to all who witnessed it, and to us today, that God specializes in using the unlikely and the overlooked to accomplish His purposes. In the next part, we'll explore the aftermath of David's victory, the lessons it holds for our spiritual walk, and the deeper truths about how God uses adversity to prepare us for greatness. Stay with us, because the story of David and Goliath is far from over. The aftermath of David's victory reverberated throughout Israel. News of the shepherd boy who defeated a giant spread like wildfire. People marveled at his bravery, but for David, it was never about his own strength or glory. He knew that the victory belonged to God. This humility is one of the key reasons David's story continues to inspire us today. However, David's journey didn't get easier after Goliath's fall. In fact, it marked the beginning of new trials and challenges. King Saul, who had initially doubted David, soon became consumed with jealousy. The people sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands," a refrain that stoked Saul's insecurities. Despite being anointed by God and used mightily, David's life became a series of battles, not just on the battlefield but within relationships and his own heart. This brings us to a critical lesson. Victory doesn't mean the end of struggles. Sometimes it marks the beginning of a greater calling, one that requires perseverance, faith, and trust in God's timing. David's triumph over Goliath was a pivotal moment, but it was only the start of his journey to becoming Israel's greatest king. Let's pause and reflect on this. How often do we view a single victory as the end point, only to find that it leads to new challenges? David's life teaches us that each triumph is a stepping stone in God's larger plan. It's not about avoiding hardship, but about growing through it. David's preparation for Goliath is another powerful example of how God works in our lives. As a shepherd, David spent countless days in solitude, honing his skills with the sling and tending to his flock. These seemingly mundane tasks were, in reality, divine training for the moment he would face Goliath. Think about the small moments in your own life. Are you overlooking them, seeing them as insignificant, or are you trusting that God is using them to prepare you for something greater? David's story reminds us that nothing is wasted in God's plan. Every experience, no matter how ordinary it seems, has a purpose. Another striking element of this story is David's focus. When others saw Goliath's size and strength, David saw an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power. This perspective is critical for us as believers. How often do we focus on the size of our problems instead of the greatness of our God? Delivered David's confidence wasn't arrogance, it was faith. He knew that the same God who him from the lion and the bear would deliver him again. This unwavering trust allowed him to step into a seemingly impossible situation with boldness. And it's a reminder for us. When we focus on God's promises instead of our circumstances, we can face any challenge with courage. But David's story also points to a deeper spiritual truth. In many ways, David is a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. Just as David stood alone against Goliath, representing Israel and securing their victory, Jesus stood in the gap for all of humanity, defeating the ultimate giant, sin and death. David's victory reminds us of the power of a single act of faith. He didn't wait for a committee's approval or for all the circumstances to align perfectly. He simply stepped out, trusting that God would guide him. This boldness is something we're all called to emulate in our walk with Christ. As we consider the spiritual battles we face today, let's remember David's example. He didn't fight with conventional weapons. He fought with faith. His reliance on God, rather than on human strength, is a powerful reminder that the battle belongs to the Lord. The story of David and Goliath isn't just an ancient tale. It's a living testimony of how God can use anyone, regardless of their background, experience, or status, to achieve extraordinary things. It's about stepping out in faith, trusting in God's promises, and allowing Him to work through us for His glory. In the final part, we'll delve into the lasting legacy of David's victory and the profound impact it has on our lives today. Stay tuned, because there's still so much more to uncover in this timeless story. As David's victory over Goliath reverberated through Israel, it sparked a renewed sense of hope and faith among God's people. But the true impact of this event went far beyond the battlefield. David's courage and unwavering faith in God set a powerful example for generations to come. His victory became a symbol of the triumph that is possible when we trust in the Lord, even in the face of overwhelming odds. David didn't just defeat a giant that day, he demonstrated a spiritual principle that remains true for us today. God's power is made perfect in our weakness. In the eyes of the world, David was an unlikely hero, a young shepherd with nothing more than a sling and a few stones. But in God's eyes, he was a mighty warrior, chosen to bring glory to his name. This truth should challenge us deeply. How often do we look at our own weaknesses and feel disqualified from doing great things for God? How often do we face obstacles and think we are too small, too insignificant, or too unprepared? Yet the story of David shows us that God doesn't choose the powerful or the experienced. He chooses those who are willing to step out in faith, trusting in his strength, not their own. In the aftermath of Goliath's defeat, the Israelites were filled with joy and praise. They celebrated the victory, but they also recognized that it was God's intervention that had brought them the victory. The entire nation witnessed firsthand the power of God working through one young man's faith. But let's not overlook the deeper spiritual significance of David's victory. Just as David was willing to face Goliath, so too are we called to face the giants in our own lives. Whether it's fear, doubt, addiction, or any other stronghold, the giants we face today may seem just as insurmountable as Goliath appeared to the Israelites. But we must remember that the same God who delivered David from the giant is the same God who is with us today. David's story points to the ultimate victory won on the cross by Jesus Christ. Just as David faced the giant with nothing but faith in God's power, Jesus faced the greatest giants of all, sin, death, and the grave, and he defeated them once and for all. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus secured the ultimate victory for all who believe in him. As we reflect on David's courage and faith, let's consider how we can apply this story to our own lives. Are we facing giants today? Are there areas where we feel defeated or hopeless? The story of David reminds us that with God, we can face any challenge, no matter how big it may seem. Let's also take a moment to consider the nature of true victory. David didn't win by his own might. He won because he trusted in God. And the same is true for us. Victory in our lives comes not from our own abilities, but from God working through us. If you're facing a giant today, remember that the battle belongs to the Lord. Don't rely on your own strength. Like David, rely on God's power, his promises, and his faithfulness. He has never failed, and he will never fail. As we close this video, I want to encourage you to take a step of faith. Maybe you've been facing your own giant for a long time, and you feel like giving up. But just like David, you can choose to stand firm, trusting in God's ability to deliver you. If you're watching today and you've never made the decision to follow Jesus, I invite you to do so now. Just as David relied on God's strength to overcome the giant, we can rely on Jesus Christ for our salvation and strength. Open your heart to him today and ask him to be your Savior. And remember, this journey of faith doesn't have to be walked alone. Find a church community near you where you can grow in your relationship with God, receive encouragement, and join others in serving him. Thank you for joining us here at The Godly Voice. If this message resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who may need to hear it. And don't forget to check out our other videos, where we continue exploring more powerful truths from God's Word. Until next time, may you face every giant in your life with the confidence that comes from knowing that the battle belongs to the Lord.